Helen Brady from the International Criminal Court. First visit here at Chautauqua. What did Fatu said you could expect?
Well, both Fatu and James were very positive about the experience. Basically, I got a phone call, actually from Fabrizio Guariglia, who is the director of Prosecution Division and was here last year. And he said, "Helen, you know how much I love you?" I'm like, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'm sending you to, or Fatu has decided that you're going off to Chautauqua." I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, right, just remind me what that is again." And he basically just said, it's that meeting, the international prosecutors get together and discuss, dialogue and talk about international criminal justice issues. I said, "Sure, that sounds really interesting." So, and then I spoke to Fatu and James, and they said, it's a really good few days. You'll meet, firstly you'll see a lot of old friends, people, that I've dealt with, the academics I know, the scholars in the area, the other prosecutors. And then it's this sort of interesting mix of, Americans who are very supportive of international criminal justice and young students. And there's just a great feeling and a great atmosphere. And I think, it's completely lived up to that.
So, from Australia?
I am from Australia, yes.
Whereabouts?
Originally I'm from Canberra, and then when I finished my university, I went to the Australian National University, and when I finished my law studies, I moved to Sydney. And then, so usually when an American asks me, I just say Sydney because it's easier. But if you want the full story, it's I feel I'm from both Canberra and Sydney.
So when they play rugby,
don't ask me about rugby. I don't know that much.
The black something, from Australia,
they're the All Blacks. They're New Zealand.
Okay.
Right. So that's But the Australians are very good rugby players.
Yeah.
It's not so much my forte or interest, but I know we're good.
So my only aspect of Australia, and I'm much older than you, Helen. There was a entertainer named Rolf Harris.
Oh yeah.
Timey Kangaroo Down Sport.
Yes.
That was my vintage time period. Whatever happened to him?
Oh well, he didn't have a very good end actually.
Oh no.
Yes, he had some very serious charges against him. He was a very big entertainer in my day. I remember him as well, but he ended up having some very serious charges, sexual assault charges against him. Yeah, in the UK, I believe, and I think he was prosecuted for those. So he had a very big fall from grace.
Oh, we're just okay. Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I brought up the subject.
Yeah, no. Well, that's what happened.
So you find yourself in a graduate of ANU, and how does one work his way into the international criminal law? It's not usually a straight path.
No, and it wasn't a path that I even really thought about. I mean, when I went to university, it was in the 1980s. So I finished university, I graduated, it was 1988 by the time I finished. And, at that stage, the big push there was you joined a law firm. You joined one of the big law firms, and that's what I did. I joined, a Sydney law firm, major one. I ended up spending about 4 years actually working both in a law firm in Sydney as well as in San Francisco. I'd had a connection with San Francisco because my family was there when I was a teenager. So I lived in San Francisco for many years then and went to high school. So the US and especially San Francisco had a huge resonance with me. So I basically was doing more or less commercial litigation and transactional work for my first few years. But I knew that I wanted to do more, and I wanted to do something more in the area of sort of human rights, something people-oriented. When I was at the large law firm I talked about in Sydney, there was a secondment program that happened, and the secondment was to a legal centre where I went for 6 months, and that was very life-changing, because there I was exposed to doing criminal law, family law, helping people. The people would come in for advice, and that for me was like law in that you could really use law to help people. I also got very interested just generally doing court work and going to court, seeing how it happened. I was going to court when I worked at the large law firm, but it was on these massive cases that I couldn't relate to as much because of the nature of the claim. It was commercial claims, and when I did the smaller cases, it sort of resonated. And I think from that point, I decided I wanted to do something sort of either in criminal law or human rights. It was a matter of finding the right fit. So I joined the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions in Sydney, and that was a very good experience. There, I received I got experience in all different areas of criminal law, criminal prosecution work. Looking at evidence all the time, going to court, running, from smaller matters. From the very first day, you were handed a pile of files, and you were just sort of thrown into court, and you were sort of more or less reading the file as you go. Some of them were small cases, but I knew then that I wanted to practice in criminal law. But I still didn't know that such a thing, because international criminal law was just coming of age then. I began to hear about people at my office who had gone to this place called The Hague and were working in this International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which had just set up. It was 1993 and 93, 94. And I thought, well, that would be very interesting. But again, it was more or less just a kind of a vague thought. Mm-hmm. It was nothing concrete. So I was working there for a few years, and I decided I would go and do a master's in international criminal law, or international humanitarian law, those sort of subjects, international human rights. And I applied, and I went to Cambridge in the United Kingdom. And that was really a wonderful experience. And that was the most concrete. That was the time where what I'd been doing as a criminal prosecutor, I did courses there on international criminal law, and I think that was the very first time that you could study international criminal law as a discipline in a master's level course. In fact, I think my lecturer said, this is the first course in the world on international criminal law. That was Professor John Dugard. And it was the most amazing course, and it really changed the trajectory of my career. So I also remember him talking about the International Criminal Court, and he had a draft under his arm. He had been in the ILC, the International Law Commission, and he kind of came in one day with this draft for a draft statute for the ICC. And I thought, oh wow, well, that's interesting. Oh, I'd love to get involved in that, but of course I didn't really know, how or how would I get involved in something like that. After my master's, I went to work at the ICTY just for a short stint. My office in Sydney was prepared to do a secondment, and I went and I joined the ICTY as an intern in the Office of the Prosecutor. And I spent about 8 months there, had an amazing experience. And
was Carla there then?
And it was Louise Arbour at that point. Okay. Yeah, so it was really back in the day. And I worked in a team that did the sexual and gender-based violence crimes, and it was a trial team, investigation trial team, and we put together the indictments for several cases. Well, I went back to Australia after that experience, so a couple of years away doing the masters and then that, and I worked in the office of the DPP, and I think at that point the Australian government was putting together its delegation for the ICC, for the negotiations. And that was really a very fortunate situation. I got to know the Australian delegation, the people who were in it, and there was a decision taken to take representatives, because Australia is a federal system like the US, and we have both federal and state, but most of our criminal prosecution work is done state level. So I was working for the New South Wales office of the DPP, and the Australian government took a decision that on our federal delegation to the ICC we would have representatives of states, and New South Wales, my state, was one of the ones that put up the representative, and that was me. Yeah, and so that's how I ended up on the Australian delegation. So I think that was probably one of the most interesting parts of my career so far, where I was, by my normal job was working in Sydney in the office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and then I would also be negotiating and drafting the statute and going to the various meetings. So I went to Rome, to the Rome Conference, and to the PrepComs, the Preparatory Commission meetings in New York. And basically 6 or 7, well, Rome was 1998, and then 6 or 7 PrepComs on top of that to draft. I was very involved in drafting the rules of procedure and evidence, especially for the ICC. Probably that's my area of law I really like, procedural law. And did that, and then at the end of that process I realised, I should apply to actually go to The Hague and work there. And so I did. And then the rest is history. I joined the ICTY about 18 years ago, 2001, and I was at the ICTY for many years, for about 12 years. I had 1 year where I went.
Were you there with Milosevic still trials?
I was there for basically, yes, from the whole, most of the cases that, from Milosevic to Karadzic, Mladic, all those cases really. As an appeal lawyer, we did the final appeals of all the accused. I went to the ICC, but by the time the Karadzic and Mladic cases came up on appeal, I had already gone to work at the ICC. But all the early cases from the Omarski cases, yeah.
Let me stop you for a second. Milosevic dies during the time you're there.
That's right.
What was the emotional reaction of the trial, or of the whole team?
Well, it was quite devastating, really. I mean, the trial team had put in, a huge amount of work. By that stage, I forget exactly, but a few years worth of trial had gone on, and the final trial brief had just been finished, right? So this was right at the end of the trial. And I remember very personally because my husband was also working on that case. And he was one of the drafters at that point of the final trial brief. And he came home on the Friday night and was sort of like so relieved because they had the final trial brief finished. Saturday morning, I distinctly remember just being in the living room, and a phone call, one of our friends from the ICTY rang and said, "Have you turned on the TV? Have you seen what's happening?" And so we turned it on, and it was like, oh no, that's terrible. Because of course, at the end of the day, it would have been better to get, justice in the form of a verdict. No one, of course, wants to have the situation where the accused dies during trial. Yeah. That's unsatisfying. But so I remember it very much also from a personal point of view, because my husband was going, I can't believe we did all that work.
So when that day is done in the Milosevic trial, you gathered all this evidence. Part of the evidence is just the presentation of it. for the media or the victims to know that it's been pulled together. What happens when the defendant dies? Does that get sealed up? Is that?
Well, no. I mean, the good thing about the ICTY and all the cases there, and I mean, there were probably about 100. I think there were about 106, 110. My memory serves me. 110 accused persons who were tried, most of whom were convicted. Some pleaded guilty. Then most were convicted, and then there were, I used to know these figures very well, but a group of them that were acquitted. All of that, the good thing about the ICTY and these courts is that it is a preservation of historical record. So yes, of course, at the end of the day, it was disappointing to have an accused who died, mid-trial. But then again, that evidence has been recorded. Witnesses came, victims came, they told their stories, just as they did in all the other 100 cases. And that's very important for a historical recording of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just as much as, say, the Nuremberg trials have recorded that for posterity in the same way, ICTY, and again, the ICC, it's all there. The filings are there, the submissions are there. People can go through it. I mean, trials are not, they're not the writing of a historical book, of course, because it's one part, there'll be a focus on, say, particular charges. It's to do with, how the indictment or the document containing the charges is framed. But nevertheless, it is a historical record of which is, hopefully leading to the truth about what happened.
Well, again, back to Milosevic, I'm not a trial lawyer, so this may sound like a dumb question, but people have done a lot of motion practice, a lot of determinations, decisions made as the trial progresses. Is that of record that's available?
Yes, absolutely. There is, and again, that's a huge benefit of the ICTY and the ICTR, the Rwanda, is that it's a very important creation. There's been a very important creation of precedent. And so there are literally tens of thousands of decisions, tens of thousands. And these precedents form very important, they're very important precedents for our own work at the ICC. Now, ICC, we have our own statute and rules and the whole documents that we wrote in Rome and then in New York during the PrepComs. So it has a different, we don't share the same statute, but a lot of the law that is applied can be drawn on, both the substantive and the procedural law. So it's very important, not just Milosevic, all of them.
Yeah, I just always curious when in the middle of a death whether you can use some rulings, for example, that occurred during the Milosevic trial, obviously argued, obviously decided, and appealed.
Well, you see, in both of in the ICTY and ICTR, you have this concept of adjudicated facts, which means that if facts have been decided by a trial chamber and then affirmed on appeal, they could potentially, we're talking about facts about the crime incidents, they could potentially be used in later trials. And that happened. But you see, Milosevic died at a time before the trial judgment. So the facts, because they were never adjudicated. But in terms of legal precedents of all the decisions that were issued on the various procedural, there's a lot of procedural law that's really important from that case. That's completely useful.
So when you walked in a courtroom one day and you saw him, what did you think?
Well, I wasn't a trial lawyer, right? I was an appeal lawyer, so I was never, actually in court prosecuting him.
But you're curious, right? I mean, you were in a...
Oh, you mean to watch or in the courtroom?
I always talk, I'll give you, for instance, I've interviewed a lot of people who were at the Nuremberg trial last 20 years ago, and always the first question is, when you walked in as a spectator, participant, and you eyeballed Hermann Goering for the first time, what did you think? They had a reaction. So similarly, if you walked in knowing as much as you knew, had read about Milosevic, what did you think?
I thought that this is exactly what international criminal justice is about, that it's important that we try the most senior leaders for these crimes. So it was, I don't want to say a relief, might not be the right word, but it was like, this is right. This is right. And I think what's important for international criminal justice is that a fair trial needs to be run with full respect for the rights of the defense. And so, I thought, okay, here we have a very civilized system, and it's a correct system where we don't just, do what some societies may have done in the past and taken justice into our own hands, but we have a proper process for trying people and making sure that their charges are tried in the most fair way, with full respect, due process of law, and then the outcome obviously will, determine their liability for these very serious crimes. So the same, I think I remember in some ways more, the big thing was when Milosevic came to The Hague. That was a huge deal. And that was relatively early on when I first got to the court. But I remember extremely clearly when Radovan Karadzic and Mladic, when they came, because that was even more unexpected. There had been so long, the court had been going on, the tribunal had been in existence for a number of years. And of course, Karadzic was in hiding, he was on the run. No one expected that we were going to see Karadzic at the court, or Mladic for that matter. And when they came, I think this was a day of the international criminal justice. It was a very satisfying day. Days when they came.
I know several years your boss, Serge Brammertz, would come here and he goes, I know the first question, Karadzic, Mladic, we don't have them yet, just wanted to get it out of the way. Because that was
but, and this goes back to, I think, some of the discussions we had here this morning, that international criminal justice, you have to play the long game. You have to be very patient. You have to work through the detail. This is not an easy, quick fix, where we sort of, everything happens, you get the indictment out, you have a quick trial. No, it is a process, and people have to appreciate that justice can take some time. It can take some time for the person to come to the court, let alone the trial itself. And again, as I stress, it has to be a fair trial. Part of fair trial is also a speedy trial, but I think ICTY and also the ICC are really doing a very good job in terms of allowing both parties and also victims for ICC to have that fair moment in court, and for the prosecution to have its case properly adjudicated in court, for the defence to properly be able to test the case, to call their own case, and for the victims as well to be able to make their submissions, make their representations. That's hugely important for the victims. So, yeah.
Then you find yourself in the International Criminal Court. Was that did they solicit you, or is that just a natural progression for you?
Well, it was a bit of a combination. I'd been at the ICTY for about 12 years by the time, there was a certain jobs that I was interested in at the ICC, and the job of Senior Appeals Counsel became free because the person who was in that job was promoted to a different job, and I was asked if I was interested in that job, but then of course I had to go through, and there was a very lengthy selection process. It's quite a rigorous process to join the ICC, involving interviews, written tests, doing a mock court presentation in front of the prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, James Stewart, Fabrizio Goriglia, very testing interview questions. I wasn't entirely confident that I would get the position. Mm-hmm. I was hopeful, I felt like I put my best case forward, but, I had a fair amount of experience for the job, but, and I'd been Senior Appeals Counsel at the ICTY, so, but, it was still, and it was quite a long wait for the decision, because these things can take some time in the ICC. And then when I got the job, I was ecstatic. The day I got it, I was ecstatic, because this was my dream, to work at the ICC, which was the place, which I was one of the people who helped create it, So it was really, I loved the ICTY, but the ICC is something even more special, because this sort of personal connection, and it's been really, really satisfying working there. My section and we do basically all the appeals, all the final appeals, all the interlocutory appeals. So it's a lot of work. We have people from many different nationalities. I think at the court itself there are 100 different nationalities working there. In my section, I work with people from Italy, from India, the United Kingdom, Australia, Uganda, Spain, probably leaving out some, but a number of different countries. And you sort of think, well, with all those nationalities, how can they get along and get the job done? But it's a very good group, and we do work very well together. Come from different systems, but many of us have kind of grown up in the international criminal justice system, which involves quite a unique, sort of a hybrid system, mm-hmm. a procedural system. So, of course, I think like a common law lawyer, but I've been working almost 19 years in a mixed tradition now. So I understand how the civil law people think, and I understand a lot about criminal law in civil systems. The ICC is a sort of a hybrid of the common law and civil law, trying to look for the best of both worlds. So we do all that, and we also do all the legal advising work. We work a lot with the trial teams. It's very integrated. So we'll advise on, one moment I can be advising on a legal issue in, say, the Mali case. Next thing I'm advising on a legal issue in one of the, let's say, Central African Republic cases. Next moment you're turning to Libya. Then you're turning to, doing appeal work. So it's a really interesting mix. For me, that's great. I loved the ICTY, but at the end, being there 12 years, you're basically working in one region. It's, of course, there was Kosovo cases, and there were Serbian, there were Croatian cases, but Bosnian Serb cases. But the ICC is so varied. You can be working on 6 different countries in the same day.
When Chief Prosecutor Bensouda was here a few years ago, we had a lot of fun with her. She's such a gregarious person. She talked about the time that Ben Ferenz was there and actually robed up and gave part of the closing statement. Do you remember that?
Well, actually, that was just before my time.
Okay.
But that was in the Lubanga case, in the, I think it was the final submissions in Lubanga, but that would have been just before my time. Yeah. So I didn't see that. But I know Ben Ferenz because I know him from the Rome conference, and he's a complete live wire. He's fantastic.
Yeah, he's an original. Do you find it a bit humorous that sometimes you will be arguing, or your group will be arguing on appeal, procedural law issues of which you were the drafter?
Well, it's very interesting when that happens. Yeah, because sometimes what happens sometimes is that you can see how a rule was drafted, or ultimately, was drafted, and you know the history behind the rule. So I can remember, or, sometimes I have to push my memory cells because it's 20 years, 18 years up to 18 to 20 for when we negotiated and drafted the rules and the statute. And so sometimes I have to sort of really remember. I have a lot of notes from the negotiations because I pretty much kept everything. So this will be my, legacy one day. I'll sort it out and I'll be like, yeah, I've got like the handwritten notes that people were sending to each other in the negotiations. So I will often look back at the notes or how things came out. My notes are not, they're pretty accurate, but of course, when you're in a negotiation, you're trying to keep up with the discussion, you're thinking about what you're going to say. So, sometimes they're a bit sketchy. So I'll read them and I'll kind of remind myself, oh, that's right. Oh, that's why it ended up being like that. And then my section will say, oh, but Helen, why? Why did you guys write it like this? And I'm like, you had to be there. But seriously, because the negotiations were so complex and so complicated, and they were often you had to compromise. And so a lot of the rules were left sort of what they call constructively ambiguous. Mm-hmm. And sometimes a bit, so constructively ambiguous that the meaning is not entirely clear. And that's because the only way we could get agreement, if this group of countries was pushing for this particular outcome and another was hugely opposed, then in order to find common ground, often it was to leave the rule a little bit open. And so we have a lot of litigation now as a result of some of these constructive ambiguities.
How did it solve the definition of war of aggression? Come on, I thought for Helen you'd have that.
That one, I wasn't specifically involved with those negotiations. By the time the crime of aggression, that whole definition, I was already working at the ICC. Well, I was at the ICTY, and then during Kampala, and then they had the negotiations later on. But the beauty or whatever was that they would do a place saver for the crime of aggression. So the details of it, because it was too difficult, it was one of those too difficult basket. And so the idea was you would push it off to a later conference because it was just, there were so many complicated issues. My specialty in Rome and later was, because my background was as a criminal prosecution lawyer. And so the areas that I was, keen on were the general principles of criminal law, part 3 of the statute, the trial, the pre-trial, the trial stage, the appeal, little bit on sentencing, although that was sort of handled by someone else in our delegation, but these very concrete criminal justice issues were really my thing. The sort of what we might call the more political issues, and I put, the aggression, were mainly handled by the diplomats in the delegations because of the sensitivity of issues.
The United States obviously is a non-signatory to the Rome Treaty. Does that preclude natives from the United States to be part of the ICC team?
No. We have a number of Americans who do actually work at the court. Mm-hmm. So in the prosecutor's office, we do have Americans. I mean, some of them hold dual nationality, but there are others who are just, only the one nationality Americans. So there's not as many Americans working at the court as there were at the ICTY. The ICTY, there were a large number of Americans and Australians and Brits and Canadians. The ICC is a much more, one of the first things that actually struck me when I first started working there was it was more geographically diverse. And you could, you feel it. You go to the cafeteria, you hear more languages, you see more faces from everywhere. It's more diverse. But yep, we've got Americans there. Yeah, and they make a great contribution.
I assume there's a certain level, though probably ill-defined, where they will not be politically permitted to get above.
Well, you see, now I don't know how that will work. I mean, for people who are already working at the court, I think that they would be, for promotional purposes, I'm sure treated equally. But, maybe you're right. There's certain positions. There's also, we have a strong push now for hiring for people who are coming from the state parties. The state parties are the ones who are paying for the court.
Sure.
So nationals of state parties, we actually have in our HR, in our ads for jobs, that preference will be given to people from state parties, and also we are also trying to redress a gender sort of imbalance, because we need to improve on that front. Get more women into the senior positions. It's a little bit imbalanced at the moment. So yeah, maybe with Americans at this stage. It could be a bit difficult to get into the very top jobs.
What's the real politics of life, unfortunately.
Yeah.
What's a question I should be asking you that I haven't?
Oh. Let me think. In terms of students becoming interested in this area, or
your experience. Obviously, you've had an experience, and yours is not unlike most who you never. If you look at every one of these folks that I've interviewed, started here to the left, ended over here to the right. Somehow they ended up as a chief prosecutor or in a high position. Never expecting that to happen. There's no direct path to do that, and I guess, or maybe the best thing is. What's a message, if you were talking to the Allegheny College students right now, who were here tonight, what's the message you'd leave to them if they had some inclination or interest?
I would say, it's a great career path. I would encourage students to always get experience in your own jurisdiction, in your home jurisdiction, because to be useful in an international arena, I think you have to know your own system first. Also, to just purely dedicate your life, your career to an international one, you could feel like, well, wow, I missed out. I never had that national experience. I think it's important. I'm glad I worked, for quite some years in a national jurisdiction before I went into the international, although there's a connection between what I was doing nationally and internationally. But I mean, I would encourage it for sure. It's a very rewarding career. You don't have to wake up in the morning and ask yourself, why am I going to work? Every day is pretty interesting. It's rewarding. I think you're doing something that will, help humanity, hopefully, ultimately. And, I couldn't recommend it more, basically. So I'd say go for it.